There is nothing more disappointing than a mushy pickle. I've gone through, 10 pounds of pickles just to have the end result be soggy and mushy. So over the years, I've learned a few tricks to help you achieve the crispiest, crunchiest, yummiest pickle possible. Trick 1 to crunchy pickles. Before you begin your process, clean your pickles well in cold water and then soak them in ice water. Do this for at least a half an hour before you begin the pickling process, but you can soak them in icy water in a bowl in your refrigerator for up to about 12 hours. I wouldn't recommend going more than 18 hours. You'll want to make the water as cold as possible. Add a half a cup of pickling salt to the water and just let them soak. The second tip to ensure your pickles come out crunchy after you've soaked them in the icy cold salt water for at least a half an hour, you're going to want to trim off the end of the cucumber where the blossom was. Now, if you haven't done this before, it can be a little tricky to know what side that is. Typically, if you aren't growing your own cucumbers, you're going to get them and they're going to look like this. There's not going to be much stem there. And the very end is going to have this little dimple in it. It just kind of looks like a light colored scar, kind of. So that's the end you actually want to trim off. You can leave the end where the stem was, where it was attached to the vine. The end where the blossom was contains an enzyme that actually causes the pickle to soften. So you want to trim off about 1/4 inch or so from that end. Now I brought a pickle in from my garden, a cucumber in from my garden that I just picked, just to kind of show you. So this is very clearly the stem, and this one still actually has the dried blossom on it. So that is the end you're going to want to trim off to help. Just another great tip to be sure that you end up with crunchy, delicious pickles. Along with trimming off the end that the blossom came from, at this point, if there's any part of the cucumber that is mushy, go ahead and trim it and just throw it away. There's nothing that you're going to do in the pickling process that will crunch that up. Once it's mushy, it's going to stay mushy. So just go ahead and trim it off and continue on your way. Our next step is to get the brine going. So this is the watery liquid that is actually going to... Our next step is to heat up the brine. So this is the liquid that you'll actually pour over the cucumbers into the jars. The first thing you're going to do is cut a square-ish shape of cheesecloth to make your spice, little spice ball. What you can do instead of that is if you have like a stainless steel tea for tea leaves, you can use that as well. But you just want to cut a little bit of cheesecloth, do about 2 tablespoons of pickling spice. You can buy it anywhere you find your canning supplies, or you can find a recipe and just make up your own. So put about 2 tablespoons in your cheesecloth, and we're just going to tie it up here. Best you can do. If some of the spices leak out into the vinegar and water, that's not a big deal at all. This just allows the vinegar and water to infuse with the spices without leaving the spices in the water. So just tie it up nice and tight, and you'll actually drop this right into your stainless steel pot. Just like that. So depending on the recipe you're using, typically a pickling recipe is pickling salt, a little bit of sugar, water, and vinegar, and your spices. One note about water: here where I live, we have really hard water, so we have a lot of minerals in our water. So when I'm canning, I choose to use distilled water in my brines. That just helps to not cloud up the brine the longer it sits on the shelf. I don't think it harms the food in any way, it just doesn't look as fresh and as pretty, so I use distilled water. Again, depending on the recipe, you'll use white vinegar, apple cider vinegar sometimes. I prefer to buy it in bulk, so I buy just jugs of it all the time. I use vinegar for so much. So we will do our distilled water right into our pot, and our vinegar. Let's see, 6 cups. 6 cups of vinegar. I've tried doubling recipes for large batches of pickles, and honestly, it never works out for me. So what I do instead, and plus I don't have a very big pot to do giant batches of brine, so I just stick to the recipe. It's really easy to make up, so I just make it up as I need more. It just turns out better that way. Okay, so I have my pickling salt and my sugar. Let's see, quarter cup. Okay, put all that in there along with our little spice bag. We're just going to heat that up to boiling, being super careful not to burn the sugar, so heat it slowly, and you're just going to let it simmer for about 15 minutes. While my cucumbers are in their water ice salt bath soaking, I like to prep my canner, my jars, and my lids and rings. You don't have to run out and buy any sort of an expensive water bath canner. To keep things very simple, as long as your jars are able to be fully submerged in boiling water, they will do what they need to do to preserve your food. I do recommend, highly recommend, that you get some sort of a rack or make one to put your cans, to put your jars on. This keeps the jars up off the direct heat on the stove. So a nice large pot, you may already have one in your kitchen. This is a very inexpensive one. I think I even maybe got it at a thrift store even. It doesn't need to be anything fancy, just nice and deep so that your jars can be fully submerged in the hot water. When you get ready to get your jars ready, I just like to put them in the dishwasher and do a quick cycle on them, even just do the heat cycle, the dry cycle, to sterilize them. Your rings and lids, if you're buying new jars, they will come with the lids and rings that you need. If you're reusing jars, that's awesome. You can totally do that. You can just want to buy some replacement lids. You can reuse the rings over and over again as long as they're not damaged in any way and as long as they're not rusty or anything like that. You don't want to reuse the lids, so go ahead and buy replacements of these. Another thing to note is you don't want to be using reused spaghetti jars or pickle jars that you're buying from the store. You don't want to can your food reusing those jars. You want to get canning specific jars, otherwise it won't seal properly. So go ahead and fill your canner with water. You want to fill it, most canners have this inner rim in here, fill it up to that inner rim and go ahead and get it boiling on the stove. It will take quite some time to bring it up to be fully rapidly boiling. So you want to go ahead and do that while your brine is heating up. The next step is to pack your jars. Now, I've decided to keep my cucumbers whole. So you just want to go ahead and get them stuffed into the jar as tight as you can without bruising them. I always like to use more jars than overstuffing them. It's really important that you keep, a headspace is what it's called. So you don't want the pickles stuffed in here so far that they're up and over the jar. Obviously you won't be able to close it. But in order for these jars to build up pressure and seal appropriately, they need a nice big headspace in here. What happens when they're put into the water bath is that as they boil, pressure builds up, and the pressure is then leaked through the ring and the lid from that headspace, causing a really, really airtight seal. It's killing the microorganisms, the enzymes, and it's also creating an airtight seal so that nothing bad, no bacteria or anything can get in. So that headspace is very important. It may seem like you're wasting space, but it's better to keep the jar underfilled than to overfill it. At this time, if you want to do spears or slices, you can go ahead and slice your cucumbers up any way that you prefer and get them stuffed nice and tight into your jars. This is usually a kid job. I have them stuff the jars. So this one, these are actually bigger cucumbers than normal, but this one could work. Just kind of puzzle them in there to get them stuffed nice and tight, like I said, without bruising them. Always a little bit of a Tetris game. All right, once the jars are stuffed with the cucumbers, you can add whatever else to your jars that you want, and it totally depends on preference and whatever recipe you're using. I like to keep things simple. I add fresh cloves of garlic, mustard seed, and fresh dill. Kind of the big ingredient here is the fresh dill. If you can't get your hands on fresh dill, you can substitute dill spice and dill seed. You can find it in any spice aisle. Okay, my recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of mustard seed per jar. So I'll add that right directly into the jar. I do this before I add the brine. We also love garlic. I ended up with giant loaves of garlic, and so I'm gonna go ahead and cut these into thirds. One of the best parts that we fight over as a family once the pickle jar is empty is who gets to eat the pickled garlic. It's delicious. So I'll do a nice chunk of garlic into each jar. More if you prefer. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and do the sprigs of garlic, or garlic dill. It says, I think my recipe, 8 to 10 per jar. It's totally, doesn't have to be perfect. I just like to do a nice big chunk of dill per jar. Once this is done, and once your brine has simmered for the appropriate time, you'll be ready to add your brine. Okay, our jars are ready to add the brine. So you'll just want to pull out the little spice packet. A crucial canning, super inexpensive canning tool that you're going to want to pick up is a canning funnel. So this fits nicely on wide mouth jars or regular mouth jars, and it just allows to add the liquid super easily. So just fit it on there. We're going to add the liquid until it's covering the cucumbers, leaving a headspace at the top. So we want at least a ½ inch of headspace. So we don't want any liquid coming up to the very brim of the jar. We want to leave about a ½ inch where there's no liquid. Your brine will be hot, so do this carefully and slowly. It's always easier to underfill the jars than to overfill them. So you'll see I left the, everything is submerged, but there is about a ½ inch of headspace. Okay, our jars have the brine in them. They have the dill seed, the mustard seed, the garlic, peppers if you like. Now this is a secret that took me years of just reading and learning and talking to people. The real super trick, the third trick to the crunchiest pickles, is adding a source of tannins to keep them crispy. You can do this by buying pickle crisp from wherever you get your canning supplies, or you can choose certain plant leaves that are full of tannins that will help to keep your pickles crisp. On my new garden, my grape vines are tiny, and so it didn't produce for me enough grape leaves to use. That's usually what I use, is about a ½ grape leaf per jar. So instead of using grape leaves, I went to the forest, and my daughter Addie and I, we found black currant leaves grown wildly. And so I'm going to use black currant. There's a few different leaves that are said to have high levels of tannins that you can add to your jars of pickles to keep them crispy. So black currant is what we're using. You can also use oak leaves, raspberry leaves, grape leaves are probably the the #1 tested leaf that you can use, or you can buy Pickle Crisp from the store. So I'm going to add black currant leaf into each jar. And this really does work. It's kind of cool. You can read up on tannins. I was thinking about doing a separate video on kind of the science behind canning, why it works, how it works. So I might talk about tannins in that video. If you know me at all, you kind of know I love the science reasons why stuff works. Okay, so I added our black currant leaves. The next step is to, with a clean washcloth, wipe the rim of the jars. So anything, any salt buildup, any spices, if they were to be left on the rim of the jar while you place the lids on there, it will not seal tight. So make sure they're nice and clean. Make sure all the spices and food is tucked down below the water line. Now, at this point, you'll be ready to add your sanitized lids and jars. And mine are still heating up, so we'll do that here in just a minute. Okay, our rings and lids are heated up and sanitized. Our jar rims have been wiped clean, and we've checked headspace to make sure there's plenty of room in the jar for pressure to build up and release. And we've checked our brine to make sure it's completely submerged all of the cucumbers and spices. Now we can go ahead and add our lids and rings. So you just very gently stick it on and then twist on the ring. You want to do it hand tight. That's tight enough. You don't have to get it so crazy tight. And do that to each of your jars. Once this is done, your jars will be ready to place in the water bath canner. Mine's still heating up, so I will check back when we're ready to add them to the canner. This is another inexpensive tool that you absolutely need to get for canning. It's a jar tong, and it allows you to pick up the jar and place in and out of the hot water without dropping anything or getting burnt. So it's a very, very valuable tool. So I'm gonna go ahead and just pinch the edge of my jar. I've already kind of went through and double checked to make sure the tightener, the jars are nice and tight. My fan kicks on automatically, and it doesn't let me turn it off. So I'm sorry about the noise. So we'll just go ahead and place them in the canner. They can be touching each other, it doesn't matter. I try to keep a little gap between them. So just go ahead and fill up your canner. My canner can hold 6 quarts. These all tucked in there. Okay, and I just kind of move them around so there's a little bit of space in between them. And you want to be sure that the water is deep enough that the cans and the lids are completely submerged. So they need to be completely under the water. And you'll want to start the time for the processing once it's back up to boiling rapidly. My recipe said to boil these for 10 minutes. I always check the elevation chart to make sure that that is adequate for the elevation we're at. So 10 minutes in fact is not long enough, so I need to bump it up to 15 minutes. So once this is back to a rapid boil, I will start my timer and I will let these jars process for 15 minutes.